everybody. It's Annette Lang at Non-Boring History. And today I'm delighted to welcome Richard Walker, who is a Professor Emeritus of Geography at the University of California at Berkeley. He's editor of numerous books on economic geography and on California. And he is the director now of the Living New Deal. And that's a program to document the continuing impact of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal programs on the American landscape. So, first of all, welcome, Dr. Walker, or Richard, if I may.
Thank you very much.
Great, good to have you, and lovely to see somebody in California. What prompted this project?
Well, I think it was actually our founder, Gray Brecken, who was a student of mine, although he's my age, came back and did a PhD in the 90s. And around 2000, a little after 2000, he was looking for a project after he'd written a book on San Francisco. And he started to realize that he was seeing these New Deal projects all around the Bay Area. And he being a geographer, a historical geographer, these things caught his eye. And once he started looking around, he thought, this is amazing. There's a lot here. So he set up a project, a kind of volunteer project with friends around the area to document these things. That didn't go too far because purely volunteer projects lack funds. So he then turned to me, or I offered as a professor at that time, that I could, pry loose a little funding out of the university for some RA help, for a website, to create a website and so on. And so it took off as the California Living New Deal back in the aughts, in the 2000s. And then around 2010, we got some money to hire a manager for a while. And then we went national. We realized this was a national issue. These things are everywhere. And we needed people all across the country to gather the information and send it to us. So that's the way we work now. We have over 50 national associates around the country who send us site information. And we have staff. We have about 10 people who are paid part-time because we're a small nonprofit. And we keep rolling along and kind of growing and growing. We've documented almost 18,000 New Deal public works and artwork sites around the country.
And really, I mean, this is a very big project. This is something that clearly takes a lot of labor. And I think some of my readers and viewers and listeners are going to think that's an academic thing, that's what academics do. And I really want to sort of jump in here and say, well, first of all, it's not just about California. Let's get that out of the way. And secondly, watching your program being featured on PBS NewsHour just last week was just fantastic, because this is clearly something that the media is starting to pick up, that the public is interested in. So not just California, not just academic. What's the goal?
Not at all. No, I mean, it started within the university, but it was never meant to be an academic project, actually. It's kind of a combination of a wonderful scavenger hunt and a public education revelation project, and also lessons for today. So we try to combine all three of those things. And yes, it is national. New Deal public works were built in every county, every state, every territory of the United States. They're everywhere. And they're still there. That's what's amazing. And they're in everybody's daily life. You bump into them everywhere. I take road trips with my wife, and we just go looking for them, and you can find them in every small town, every state park of a certain age, national parks, rural areas. They are everywhere. And people are amazed when they come, when they listen to us give talks, or they come to our website and look at our map, our national map, and they realize, if you geolocate yourself on our national map, either on screen or on your phone, it'll zoom in, and you'll start to see these little dots are all around you. And people are kind of amazed by that.
I found Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I got very excited when you said this. It's a running joke at Non-Boring History that everywhere I go, I stumble into FDR. It's like I've started to say, I think he's following me. I turn around and there's an information panel that says, oh, the CCC built this, which I didn't expect.
Yeah.
But I spent 15 years in a small town in South Georgia called Statesboro, and I had no idea until I looked at your webpage that there was a mural from that had originally been, I think, in the post office in Sylvania, Georgia, that was now housed at the Georgia Southern Museum. And I actually did an exhibit there, and I had no clue that was sort of in the building, if indeed it was at that time. Murals.
I think the key phrase is
Yeah.
no clue. And most Americans have no clue. I mean, we all know that Americans are not particularly aware of history. As
I say nothing
Ford,
with this accent. I say nothing.
Henry Ford said famously, history is bunk. Or you look at the Silicon Valley bros today, it's all about, oh, we're building the future. And yet history and the past have so much to teach us. And as William Faulkner said, the past is not over. It's not even past, that it's here with us all the time. And there are a lot of intangible ways in which it's with us. But the wonderful thing that we're doing in documenting New Deal public works and artworks is that they're still with us. And it's like a lost civilization, as Gray Brecken, our founder, loves to say. It's as if you're looking around the forest for Mayan ruins in the Yucatan, and you see a few towers here and there, and you think, okay, yeah, we all remember Social Security or maybe Hoover Dam. But as soon as you get the radar and start flying over, as they're doing now, the anthropologists, it reveals these entire cities. And that's what we're doing, is we're revealing this amazing lost civilization that came from a time Roosevelt and his team at that time, administration, his ethical belief in public good and serving the public, serving the mass of the people. And it's a very unusual time in American history. But most people think that it's, labor law, it's Social Security, a couple of things like that. And they go, oh, that's lovely. That's a great legacy. Or at the time, they employed unemployed people. It isn't that nice, but who cares now?
Right.
Well, the fact is that they employed people to build things massively, and it's every corner of the country. So, and it did good for every place. A lot of places today that are very conservative, very red states, red counties, and they're chock-a-block with stuff built by basically, blue administration of Franklin Roosevelt.
I'm glad you raised that, because so many things going through my mind at the moment. Among them is, I did hear your colleague using the phrase lost civilization, and I thought, no, it's just hidden in plain sight. And we're using this stuff all the time. So the PBS segment put great stress on, obviously they were filming exclusively in the San Francisco Bay Area, but they put great stress on the monumental buildings that were built to last, and you contrast that with the glass and metal stuff that they're putting up now that clearly is meant for a quick buck. They talked about the murals, but what I kept thinking about, that your site certainly has made me aware of, is the more mundane sorts of things that you wouldn't give a second look to, but they're right there. And things like sidewalks and sewer systems. Some of the sidewalks are still in use because they were built to last. I did a project with my students at Georgia Southern about Carbon Hill, Alabama, a very conservative town that had raw sewage running down the street until the New Deal came along and provided a sewage plant, a swimming pool, and all kinds of other things. I guess I'm trying to phrase this as a question rather than telling you what you already know, Richard, but it's how do you suggest that people find out a bit more about the buildings in their communities? How do they, access this stuff and figure out what they're looking at?
Well, can I can I just pick up first on what you were saying, even though it wasn't a question?
Sure.
It is really important because what they did varied from extremely humble projects like sidewalks, curbs, gutters, sewer pipes, and so on, to these monumental things that some of us remember, like Hoover Dam or the San Francisco Bay Bridge, or ones, actually people don't remember things until they go there and they go, oh my God, there's something like the fabulous amphitheater outside in Red Rocks outside Denver, Colorado, in the Front Range. These built all by hand-placed, hand-carved stones, and it's still very much in use. Now, there are people, within the Living New Deal and within the world of sort of New Deal remembrance and enthusiasts, there are a lot of people, of course, focus on the arts, and the arts were fantastic. They're still with us. They're very inspirational, and they do speak. The WPA Public Arts Project, and Federal Writers Project, Theater Project, were part of that kind of ethical structure of we need to enlighten, entertain the American public and bring arts to them that at that time people almost never saw in their daily lives. Like even the post office murals, decorate them. And so that's really an important side of it. But at the same time, public health, the improvements in public health due to humble clinics, building better sewer systems, like Washington, D.C., which we recently did a poster print map of. It's quite fantastic if you live in that area. It had raw sewage running into the Potomac. The Potomac and the Anacostia River were sewers. And the New Deal rebuilt the sewer system, channeled it down to the first sewage plant, sewage treatment plant that the city had ever had, that's still there. In fact, some of the buildings and settling ponds are still there at Blue Plains. So they did the whole gamut. They also did a lot of service projects, which, we don't have so much memory or remnants of, which is why the Living New Deal emphasizes the physical, material leftovers and results of public works. But there were all these service projects like sewing rooms, making clothing for children, shoes for the poor, blankets for the poor, feeding kids in school, food programs that were essential to health and well-being of poor people, of the working people of the time. Okay, so now I did that. I riffed all of that. And I do want to answer your question, which was, how do people find out about this stuff? Well, we do provide on our website some research tips if you're interested. Where do you go? Well, local libraries. Local librarians love to help with these things. And there's often, local histories. There's a lot of little local histories written that you never find anywhere but in the local library that will have gems of information about what was done in the 1930s, along with stuff you may be less interested in about what happened in the town in 1870s or something like that. But usually this stuff is available. There's, of course, you can take deeper dives into public documents of city council meetings, public works, and so on. Or if you need, at a national level, you can go into the National Archives, which is full of the materials that were left by the WPA, the PWA, all these alphabet agencies who did the public work. The problem is most of that, is not organized, is not written up. The CCC, which built in every park that existed at the time, national wildlife refuges that were created at the time, built in corrals and fences and erosion features all over the rural farmlands and ranch lands and so on. They kept almost no records, and there's almost no markers. You referred to markers, but actually markers are the exception rather than the rule. I think FDR missed a bet there. He should have insisted they put a marker on everything, but it makes it that much easier to forget, unfortunately. And so our job is to look into these kind of research sources. Newspapers, newspapers.com has a lot of old local newspapers.
And a public librarian, a reference librarian, can help you access. If you say, I want to do this, that person will know specific sources, correct?
Absolutely.
That can help them.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's not that hard to do, and I've done it. I do this on road trips with my wife. We're going off to see relatives or go to a park or a part of the West that we really want to see, like southern Utah. But we stop along the way. We look at the Living New Deal map, which you can look at on your phone while you're traveling, and say, oh, there's a site. But then you'll be traveling through the town and you'll go, wait a sec, look at that high school. That looks suspiciously 1930s, what was called the PWA modern. And lo and behold, there's a plaque, or somebody knows, or you can go to the library and verify, and lo and behold, it's New Deal. So the stuff, you can stumble on it, which makes it a kind of scavenger hunt.
I love that.
Or you can follow our map to places just to see what's already been documented. And actually, you can do better because often we don't have good photographs that we need. We welcome people sending us new information like that.
Or it's something that can involve just about everybody. And, and the more you're looking at this stuff, photographs of it, the more you'll be able to recognize it. I mean, I remember my awareness of it began with WPA stamped on a sidewalk years and years ago in California. So, certainly one of the questions, we're going from present to past, from past to present, and that's what academic history does too. And that's something that, I'm constantly harping on about. This isn't then, this is now. It's right with us. Thinking about the 30s, though, it involved, the New Deal itself involved a lot of Americans, clearly from all sorts of walks of life. And one of the things I've noticed that people harping on about recently, sort of in the chatter sphere, is, well, it excluded African Americans. Can you address that?
Well, I want to address, you raised at least three things there.
Sorry, Richard, I'm excited. Yes.
Yeah. There's a reason we call our project the Living New Deal and not Remembering the New Deal, or wasn't FDR in the 20th century or something like that. It's a living New Deal because it's still there. So that's the first thing I wanted to say about the people who worked for it. The New Deal employed on public works over the course in less than a decade that it existed, from 33 to 42, and then the war basically took over. But in that time, it employed about 15 million people. And that's out of a workforce at the time of about 50 million. It's about a third of the workforce today. So the equivalent would be to hire almost 50 million people today on public work. Now, that's not all at one time, but people would sign on for 6 months, then a year with the CCC, WPA, whatever it was. Plus, there were the private contractors and their workers who built things for the PWA and so on. Okay, so American people were involved in this. It isn't just that the government, did something for us. And I think this, reminds me of JFK's, ask not what we can do for you, the government can do for you, but what you can do for America. And that was part of the genius of the New Deal. It wasn't just, we're going to stimulate the economy and we're going to hand out welfare. They absolutely believed that people wanted to work, and that what they were doing was giving unemployed people who were both economically desperate but also humiliated by their unemployment, which is true to this day. People want to work. You give them work, it gives them their dignity, gives them their meaning, and what's more, then they're building things that they see that stay there for years. So you could be a CCC volunteer, and CCC boys, as they were called, but young men, because they were all young men, would, for the next 75 years till they all died off pretty much, would have reunions and go back and visit the parks they worked in because this beautiful stonework that they did, beautiful park, ranger stations and visitor centers, trails, stone walls. This stuff was still there, and they could go and celebrate it. In fact, they often paid for statues. There's a famous statue of a CCC man in a lot of parks that the CCC alumni associations paid for, because they remembered it so fondly as both saving them from penury and contributing to the country in a way that was totally visible.
Right.
And now the third part of your question, I've now forgotten because I went through the first two, because I got excited too. After doing this for 15 years, I'm still excitable.
I absolutely grasp why. And it was really to ask, it was a very leading question about African Americans.
Oh, yes.
There's a perception that they were excluded from New Deal programs.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm working on a very long paper that's becoming like a small book now on that very question. Was the New Deal racist? And, as part of the recovery of the lost history of America, African Americans in particular, but other non-white, what we call minority groups, although a lot in California, people of color are the majority now. And, glory to that. But there's a lot of recovery of lost memory and criticism, of valid criticism of things like slavery and Jim Crow and Chinese exclusion Act and so on and so forth. It's very strong out here in California. Treatment of the Native American, which was, absolutely god awful. So this is a very important project. And it does mean that criticizing the Thomas Jeffersons and George Washington, even Abe Lincoln and so on, valid criticism right through FDR. And what our project does not do, I hope, is treat FDR as some kind of god to be memorialized. A lot of people looked at him at the time as the savior. And a lot of African American families, by the way, had pictures of FDR up in their houses.
Traveling through the South, we still were seeing in the 90s and possibly later, I saw a picture of FDR hanging up in an African American barbecue joint. And I think one of after visiting FDR's house in the Presidential Library at Hyde Park, what struck me was, my husband is from California, he's Asian American. And, we're looking for this stuff. We're looking for stuff on the internment camps and whatnot. But what was very interesting to me was just the reminder of the political context in which FDR was working and having to depend on the white South for votes. And, what I'm trying to lead you into is just to say African Americans were segregated within the New Deal, but thanks in large part to the work of Eleanor Roosevelt and particularly the African Americans advising her, people like Mary McLeod Bethune and Philip Randolph, they were really pushing for African American involvement. African Americans were there. They were in New Deal programs. They were segregated programs, but they were programs with impact on the whole community. Everybody gets involved one way or another in this.
Oh, yeah. No, the African Americans were not excluded. They were involved. There were a couple million who worked in the public works projects, the WPA and so on. They were in the CCC. People think they weren't, but they were. They, of course, also got relief in states in the South where they'd never gotten any relief. The federal government saw that they did get relief payments and so on. So I wanted to set the stage, and I rambled on too much. I apologize.
No, me too. Don't worry.
That it's so important that we rethink American history and that we don't just glorify the past, as has all too often been done, as a white history or a whitewashed history. At the same time, as a result of this, especially in the 2010s, certain key African American historians, intellectuals, brought forth, the failures of the New Deal, which were many, but they also got carried away, and you got a trope on the amongst progressives and right-thinking people. Oh yeah, the New Deal, that was racist. It excluded Black people. It did not. Mm-hmm. There were programs that had exclusions in them. Social Security excluded all farm workers and domestics in its first iteration, not necessarily because the New Dealers like Francis Perkins wanted that, but because it was actually, and it wasn't just because the Southern Democrats were so powerful, and they were, and they changed a lot of programs, but also because no social welfare program in Europe or anywhere in the world at that time included agricultural workers or domestic workers. No it was kidding. Too hard to follow them, too hard to keep track of them. And the farm sector hated the idea. Mm-hmm. And that was generally true whether you were in Wisconsin or in the South. Now, in the South, there's reasons they really hated the idea because of the importance of Black labor and sharecropping. So, and by the way, Social Security, that was rectified and changed by 1951. So, and the long-term impact of that was nil, unlike the long-term impact, say, of the exclusions built into the FHA. But even that was subtle, and it was the federal mortgage loan programs, which were actually written. The rules were written by the realtors, and it was a real failing of the New Deal. Although it was helping homeowners, millions of homeowners, they allowed them to write in these rules that then became racialized all over and created, exclusions and segregation that really mattered. Now, it is true, facilities that were built by the New Deal, like public housing, were usually segregated. And CCC ended up segregated, but it didn't start segregated. Out here in California, they had integrated camps for the first couple of years until the general hoo-ha of locals, and it was often the local communities that said, oh my God, you can't have this. Because Jim Crow was a way of life in the South. It was a political economy of the South, but it was a way of thinking that was very prominent around the North and the West as well. So we can't let the North and the West and white people there off the hook for their racism at the time. It was an incredibly racist world. And it's very hard for those of us today to project ourselves back. The old saying, the past is another country. It's hard to project ourselves and imagine what it was like to live in this kind of world where the racial inferiority was just written into the rules, was taught, was just a part of everyday thinking of white people about Black people or brown people or Asian.
I can sort of see a lot of my very sympathetic white Southern readers nodding their heads at this, knowing and just knowing the world that I came into even in the 90s in Georgia. I think what I guess I love about your project is that it's refocusing us, though, on how revolutionary the New Deal was, how radical it was, how it's still with us. I mean, we're running out of time, so I'm rushing here to talk about this, but only FDR ever managed to unite places like there's a county south of Atlanta, and I wrote about this at Non-Boring History, where 97% of voters, most of whom, of course, all of whom would have been white at that time because of restrictions on voting, voted for FDR in 1936. He came in person to bring electricity to this county, and they are still writing their checks to a New Deal program. Right. And most people don't have a clue that that's where it comes from. Oh, you just write your check to the cooperative without realizing where this is from, and it's still with us. And that really is, to me, the most pressing thing. The living part of the living New Deal is something, and really we look around at our depressingly decaying infrastructure. I know that there are, the legislation that's been passed, but the potholed roads, the collapsing bridges, the really awful, frankly, new architecture that we're seeing going up in places of lovely old buildings. And this just has so much relevance. And I'm sorry to end with me going on a long rant, but this is normal, unfortunately. But
Well, I just have to say that, yeah, you're absolutely right. And we have to see this as a very dynamic world. The New Deal itself was dynamic at the time. It changed over time. And so what started with a lot of bowing and scraping to the Southerners ended up with FDR actually fighting the South, trying to reform the South. And over the 10 years of the New Deal, properly speaking, the treatment of African Americans got much better. And we have to remember that. And then FDR completely revolutionized the judiciary so that the so-called Warren Court that passed Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, was founded on a series of decisions that were passed before that by a court that had nine FDR appointees, and eased the way for the whole civil rights movement and actually geared it up along with the Second World War. These are the New Deal and the Second World War were absolutely important in mobilizing Black people, African Americans, to fight for their rights, to get organized, the NAACP to fight these important cases, which were started, things like the exclusion of Black voters in the South started to be overturned as early as 1941, thanks to the New Deal. So it's a more complicated story than people think. It's a more dynamic story even at the time. But the point is, they meant to help the people as best they could in the context they had inherited, and they did a hell of a job, and we should do as well today.
And we are part of their continuum. It's not back then, it's right now, and you've illustrated that beautifully. I'm about to run out of time thanks to Zoom, but Richard Walker, thank you so much for your time and for a really exciting and illuminating conversation. All best to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure.